women more equitably in social protection and social development more broadly. So there is a growing international interest in gender equality and in the empowerment of women and girls, which is now Goal 5 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And it's also very much a part of the African Union's development agenda. So developing, implementing and monitoring and evaluating social policies to achieve these particular goals are high on the development agenda across different fields, whether it be in health, in education, social protection, welfare, to mention a few. So these goals also intersect, they cut across the spectrum and the SDGs. But what is important is that they also cut across poverty reduction and inequality as other goals of the SDGs. So the rise of social protection, which is cash transfers, transfer policies in countries in the global south, of which South Africa is very much a leader, and something that we should celebrate. We tend to forget that. So we have certainly taken a leading role, and so we are a rich laboratory for research and for learning to find solutions. So although social protection policies and cash transfers were not designed to achieve gender equality and women's empowerment at the outset, much of the subsequent empirical research present findings on these topics, with the outcomes being rather mixed, and that is what Zoheb will be talking about a little later. Now, feminist scholars such as Shada Razavi, Maxine Molyneux, and Sylvia Chan, to mention a few of the more prominent international feminist scholars, have been critical of cash transfers worldwide, and in the South in particular. And one of the reasons that they are critical of it relates to the lack of engagement of men in social protection programs and the way in which they say men have been marginalized in social protection. So the research presented this afternoon builds on earlier research at the CSDA conducted by myself and Tessa Hochfeld, who passed away sadly a few weeks ago, on the gender dynamics and the impact of the CSG in 2012. At that time, about 8% of men were thought to receive the CSG, but little was known about the gender impacts of the CSG on male beneficiaries. And Zoheb will show you his results and his assessment of the prevalence figures of the numbers of men who do actually access the child support grant. So this is really the missing piece of the puzzle. And what some refer to as the conundrum of men, is the puzzle of men on the one hand being problematized, that they are the problem in the whole gender equality question. And then on the other hand, there's the kind of attempt to understand how, or look at how to bring men back in to the social protection and gender equality debate. So Dr. Zoheb joined the CSDA in 2013 and was awarded a scholarship to pursue this topic for his PhD. This is the first study on the CSG and its gender impacts, including how men who receive the grant construct and do gender. It is one of a handful of studies internationally. I don't think that there are more than 5 or so that have tackled this topic. And I'm sure you're all looking forward to hearing Zoheb's results. Zoheb obtained his DPhil at UJA and is due to graduate shortly. He concluded his undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in development studies at UCT. He also did politics, economics, and philosophy. And at Ruhr University, Bochum in Germany. So he's the recipient of numerous awards towards his PhD research, including the humanities, what is it called, Zoheb?
Zoheb.
Zoheb scholarship, which is a humanities scholarship that's provided, that's awarded by the deans from all the universities around the country. So they only take the high-performing students. And Zoheb was one of the few students who got that grant. He also received the Eurosa grant, and he studied at Utrecht University in the Netherlands when he was working on his PhD, and the Department of Science and Technology and the National Research Foundation Chair in Welfare and Social Development. All his examiners were unanimous in their agreement that this was an outstanding thesis and that it could contribute significantly to our knowledge and social policies about gender, care and social protection. Zoheb is already contributing to shaping policy-oriented research in this field. He contributed to the State of South Africa's Fathers Report published by Sonke Gender Justice in 2018. He also contributed technical briefs for the East and Central and Southern Africa Social Security Association, ICASA, about
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here on this. It's hot as hell, so I appreciate the effort even more. So as Prof. Patel said, I'll be talking through my PhD work this afternoon. It's the first time that I'm presenting this to a South African audience since I finished the work last year. So I'm excited and keen to know what you think about it. So this is the outline of my presentation. First, I'm just going to summarize the evidence about the child support grant, which I'll just refer to as the CSG for the rest of the presentation. So summarizing previous research on the CSG and its effects on children and women. Note, I haven't said men because there hasn't been any research done about the way the CSG affects men. And then I'll talk a bit about gender inequality in South Africa, and as will become clear, it's very much related to the CSG, leading into how we can design social protection policies in a way that's gender sensitive. So that just means taking into account the realities of inequalities between men and women. And the CSG is a component of our social protection policy. And in thinking about how to make gender-sensitive social policy, I will be drawing on my PhD findings. And I'll talk through those findings and then discuss the implications for social protection in South Africa and in developing countries more broadly. So I'm going to talk for at most half an hour to begin with. I'll talk through the background and some of the results, and then I'll break for a little bit so we can have some questions and discussion, and then we'll take another 30 minutes at the very most to finish the findings and to wrap up. So the Child Support Grant is one of the biggest cash transfer programs in the developing world, and at the end of last year, 12 million children benefited from it. That number has definitely increased since then. I think it's only Brazil and Mexico that have bigger programs than South Africa. And across the evidence, so there's been loads of work over the last 20 years that we've had the CSG, just about the kinds of impacts that it's having. And the consensus is that it's been a very good intervention for children. So we have seen multiple studies showing that it is associated with improvements in school attendance, especially for older children. Also, it's associated with better grade completion, so a lower likelihood of kids failing. We also see positive impacts in terms of child nutrition. An example that I've cited there is a study that shows that children who receive the CSG are on average 1 centimeter taller than children of the same age that don't get it. And that's a really impressive statistic, I think. But stunting is still high. So stunting is an internationally recognized measure of malnutrition and reflects a child having a low height for their age. And that is still very high. So it's about a quarter of children. That was the estimate from last year. And that proportion has not, it's been relatively constant since 1993. Also, in terms of poverty, the findings are quite mixed. So the idea is that if you give a cash transfer to a household, this reduces income poverty. So it depends on how you measure poverty. So if we think of poverty in terms of extreme poverty, so these are Statistics South Africa's definitions of poverty, and they define extreme poverty as food poverty, which is when you don't have enough money to meet your very basic food needs and nothing else. So if we look at poverty reduction by that metric, then since the mid-90s, we have reduced poverty by half. So in the mid-90s, it was about 60% of people couldn't meet their food needs. Now it's 30%. So that's quite substantial. But if we look at a more less extreme definition of poverty, so by this standard, if you fall below a certain income level, then that means not only can you not buy food, but also non-food basic requirements like clothing and housing. So that's a slightly more generous poverty line. And if we look at poverty by that metric, then we still have more than half the population living in poverty. So they can't meet food needs and also can't meet other basic needs like clothing and housing. So despite having very clear impacts on children and on extreme poverty, it is also clear that the CSG's poverty reduction potential is limited. And that's due to many different reasons. So it's partially due to high unemployment and in combination with working poverty. So it's estimated about half of the people in South Africa that have jobs are still living in poverty despite working full time. Then there's malfunctioning public services. So when things like hospitals and clinics and schools and public transport aren't working properly, then that erodes the value of social protection. So if you just think of something like public transport, so we know that it's very inefficient and relatedly it's very expensive. So if it costs you a whole lot of money to go to the clinic, then you're using your grant money on something. So if public transport was working properly, you would be using that money on meeting your basic needs rather than on a service that should actually be working better. And then finally, the grants are just too small. So they have increased in value since the introduction of the grants 20 years ago, and they do increase every 6 months, but the increase is not tied to an objective measure of need. So the grants usually go up in October and April, and I think now it's at 430 or 440 Rand a month, and it's quite a lot below the food poverty line. So to meet basic food needs, it's more than 600. So it's not enough. So now I'll just talk a bit about gender inequality in South Africa, and this is very much reflected in that statistic. So of all of the adults, parents or parent figures who receive a child support grant, only 2% of them are men. And that is despite gender neutral targeting in South Africa, which was a very progressive policy feature and very unusual. So that's and Leila can talk more about that, but in designing the grant, they went with the principle of following the child. So the idea was we will give the grant to where a low proportion, but because so many children get grants, it's still a substantial number of people. So it's more than 120,000 men in the country that receive the grant, although that is dwarfed by the 9 million women that get it. And that statistic is just a reflection of the way our society is. So, and it reflects the gendered nature of childcare. So, and this isn't just a South African issue, so women spend more time on care work. So that's the direct work of looking after children, and then all of the indirect work that supports that, like housework and shopping. And statistics from South Africa that were derived from nationally representative household data that was collected by our national agency shows that women spend 30 hours per week on care work, and that compares to just 12 hours for men. And so some people will look at that statistic and think, well, this is probably because men are working more. So if you add that to the care work, then it'll balance out, but it doesn't. So when you add market work to care work, so market work is just what we traditionally think of work. So that's work that you're paid to do. So when you add those things together, women still work more than men. 49 hours per week, holiday. Another factor that underlies gender inequality is that father absence has historically been quite high here, but it's also increased since the dawn of democracy. So in 2014, that's the latest statistics I have, the latest year that I have statistics for, 60% of South Africa's children did not live with their biological fathers. And a substantial portion of that's because of our migrant labor system, which the way that is structured the economy persists. So there are a lot of men that are still stuck in those kind of relationships where they live far away from their families. And then there are also cultural practices like lobola, which prevent men from living with their children. But that doesn't explain everything, because in that group, there are still, in that group of 60% that don't live with their fathers, only 40% of them see their fathers at least once a month. So what this means is that women are doing the care work, so that's non-financial care of children, and because of physical father absence, they're also doing the financial work, so they have to get the income to support these kids. And so that's in the literature referred to as women's double burden of financial and non-financial care of dependents. So children, but also the people who are sick in South Africa, notably due to HIV and AIDS, and also the frail elderly. Another factor is the gender wage gap. So it's estimated that in South Africa, for doing exactly the same work, women will earn between 23 and 27% less than a man doing the same job. And all of that means that over the last 20 years, the relative risk of income poverty for women has worsened. So what this just means is, in the last 20 years, the odds of a woman being in income poverty relative to a man has increased. So in financial terms, gender inequality has worsened. And the puzzling thing about that for many people is that this is the same period of time when millions and millions of women got grants, which for many people would have been the first independent income they would have ever had. But despite that, that seems to be outweighed by all of these other issues of father absence in physical terms and also from the care work. And this is all happening despite, and this is what Prof. Patel alluded to in the introduction, gender mainstreaming. So it's the rights to equality between men and women is not a controversial issue. It is encapsulated in our constitution, also in all of the major donor agencies, in the international organizations as well. So Leila mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. So Goal 5 is directly about achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. And all UN member countries are committed to these goals. But despite that specific goal, the entire SDG focus has gender running through all of the 20 plus goals, and then also the AU agenda. So there is a growing consensus that social protection can do more to deal with the reality of gender inequality. So social protection just means policies and programs that governments take to protect vulnerable people. In South Africa, cash transfer programs are the dominant mode of social protection, as it is in many other developing countries where you have large populations of people who are income poor on a permanent basis. And the goal of these programs was to improve household consumption and child well-being in terms of nutrition and school attendance. And in most of these programs, you have what is either an explicit or an implicit targeting of women. So as I said previously, in countries like Brazil and Mexico, it's not that men can't get the cash transfer, which is their version of the child support grant. But in policy documents, it states very explicitly there is a preference for the mother of the child, and a more implicit kind of targeting where, and I'll get into this more later on when I start talking about the findings, but it's implicit in the sense that it's commonly understood to be for women only, and that there isn't really a policy effort to change that. And so these cash transfer programs are very rarely designed with gender issues in mind. But regardless of that, they have gender impacts because childcare is a gendered activity. But sometimes and in the literature you read this, they are expected to alleviate gender inequality because the majority of the people who receive the transfers are women. So the idea is that if you're giving lots of women money, that's going to be a good thing. But the evidence is increasingly showing that's not necessarily the case. So what we see in South Africa, but in other programs, is that cash transfer programs like the CSG do lead to women's empowerment, but in a very limited way. So they empower women in their roles as mothers and as carers, to the exclusion of other aspects of their identities. So they don't empower women as workers in the market or as community leaders or political leaders. And this is because there is a tendency to look at poverty in mainstream theoretical analysis, but also within governments, as an individualized phenomenon. So you see a woman that has a low income and you think, we'll solve this by providing income. So we'll give a child support grant. But that doesn't recognize that a cause of that low income to begin with is relationships with other people, so specifically with men. So if the men are absent from the household and they're not doing the care work, and the women are doing all of that themselves, then policy needs to address that too, right? So without addressing all of those issues, just giving lots of women cash transfers won't solve the fact that they still have to do all of this work alone, really. So that would, by that kind of justification, you'd say the CSG is not gender sensitive, and it ameliorates existing poverty rather than transforming the conditions that lead to it. So just a definition of what gender is. So it's a socially constructed concept referring to women's and men's different roles and responsibilities determined by social, economic, political, and cultural factors. They are interpreted differently in different societies and cultures, but in many contexts they translate into inequality in resources, responsibilities, opportunities, and constraints, especially for women. So by that definition, from this definition we can say that gender is something that's socially constructed. There is no innate or biological reason for us to say men should not be participating in childcare because they're not, they're biologically incapable of it. We can see that it's a social construction. It's sustained by social norms that men shouldn't be doing this kind of work and that women should do it. But if we look at gender in this way, then it leads us to ask the question why in most of the work on gender in the last 20, 30 years, gender is understood as being synonymous with women. So gender issues are seen as women's issues, but that is failing to account for the fact that gender is about relationships between men and women. So we're effectively neglecting half of this relationship and expecting to fix things. And there's very little research in this area, so that's why I went into this topic for my PhD, which was a mixed method study of men who received the child support grant. And the first component of this work was a statistical analysis of nationally representative survey data. So this was the NIDS, that's the National Income Dynamics Study, and it's longitudinal, so I looked at 4 waves of this data. So that just means the same people were interviewed at 4 different time points. And the main focus of that first bit of the work was just to see, well, can men be trusted with cash transfers? So in many places, and here as well, the assumption really is that women should be receiving the transfers because men are irresponsible and incapable and all of that kind of thing, and women are natural caregivers. So I looked at household spending patterns and also nutritional outcomes for children and compared them in households by whether the cash transfer recipient was a man or a woman. The second component was qualitative. So this was just to see how CSG receiving men construct gender and their masculine identities, and just to find out more about what receiving the grant means to them and how they use it. And so I did a critical discourse analysis of interviews that took place in Soweto. And those interviews were done by a visiting master's student who I co-supervised. Her name is Manon van der Meer. And then after looking at these 2 sets of findings, I looked at them together and then tried to think what the implications of those findings were for the development of more gender-sensitive social protection and specifically cash transfer programs like the CSG. So to start with, I'll just go through some of the survey findings. So the descriptive findings, on average, men are older than CSG receiving men are older than CSG receiving women, about 10 years older on average. And half of them are single fathers. So only about a third are married, 20% live with an unmarried partner. But so the point there is that most are single fathers. And low educational attainments. So it's only about 20% that have a matric or more. All of the rest of the men have less than a matric. Average per capita income per month of about 950 rand. And that didn't differ between the households depending on whether the CSG recipient was a man or a woman. So wave 4 of NIDS corresponds to a period that is from around October 2014, I think, until the first quarter of 2015. So it's not that long ago. And yeah, it's a very low amount of money. Most of the men that receive a child support grant at that point in time were the biological fathers of the children, of the child that was the beneficiary of the CSG. But there were also a fair proportion of grandfathers, and the rest was split between brothers, uncles, stepfathers, and great-grandfathers. An important finding here was that 2/3 had no caregiving support. So one of the questions in the survey was, I forget the exact wording, but it was something like, do you have someone who can help you in looking after this child? And 2/3 of the men who answered that question said that they didn't. And 1/3 of the children's mothers were deceased. So lots of maternal orphans. In terms of employment, very low employment rates, so just 40% of the men had jobs. And again, that doesn't differ much from women who receive the CSG. Interestingly though, 70% of the grant receiving men who are unemployed expressed no desire to work. So, I mean, a shortcoming of this data is that it doesn't go into a lot of detail about why. So it's hard to really know why that figure is so high. But later on, when I go into some of the qualitative data, we'll get more of a sense of why that might be. And only 15% said that they were engaged in paid casual employment. So, yeah, very low proportion report that they were doing piecework.
Sorry, can you just go back to the slide, because maybe there's a misunderstanding in your second last bullet?
Yeah.
About the 40%, it says men and women were employed.
Okay, so
And the 70% is that men only were unemployed.
so
Expressed no desire to work. Am I reading it
yeah,
correctly?
that was the men.
Okay.
So 40% of both the all of the women and all of the men that received the grant, that proportion was the same. Men and women, 40% had a job, full-time formal job. But that unemployment, it was the men. 70% said they didn't have any desire to work. So that the previous slides were about the fourth wave of data. So that's 2014, 2015. The next two slides is an analysis of 4 waves of the data. So starting from 2008. So 2008, then reading to use 2010, 12, and 14. And these are the more analytical findings, so inferential statistics derived from multiple regression analyses. The first major finding here was that households are not more likely to spend on alcohol, tobacco, and gambling when men receive the CSG. So a big concern in the literature is that if you give cash transfer or another income support to a man, then you're going to see spending on temptation goods increase substantially because men are regarded as being more irresponsible. But there's no evidence of that here, at least with this group of men. Also, children who are cared for by male recipients of the CSG are not significantly more likely to be stunted, so that's having a low height for their age, when compared to children cared for by women who get the grant. However, I've just finished an analysis that incorporates the latest wave of this data, which was released after I finished my PhD. That's the 5th wave of data from 2018. And in this wave of data, the findings are the same, except that for very small children, so this is children under the age of 5, then when those infants are cared for by men, then they are more likely to be stunted. But in either case, there were other predictors of spending on temptation goods and on stunting that were far more powerful. So when I say a predictor, I just mean a factor that is that explains or is associated with the outcomes. So that's either the spending on temptation goods or stunting in children. And these more predictive factors were, for temptation goods, were the caregiver's age. So that minus just means as the age of the caregiver increases, the amount of money that is spent in the household on alcohol, tobacco, and gambling decreases. Emotional health was a strong predictor, so caregivers who are not feeling very good emotionally spend more on these things, significantly more. Educational attainment, with more education, people spend less. People in urban and farm areas spend a lot more, and that's driven by alcohol spending. So in farm areas, that's just a legacy of the DOP system, I think, when compared to traditional rural areas. So that would be areas that are under the authority of a traditional authority. So there, the spending is not very high. And then per capita income. So as the household's income increases, then spending also increases. In terms of stunting, very strong predictors of stunting in children were, and this is more than the caregivers being a man or a woman, was the child's age. So younger children are more likely to be stunted. That's not surprising, that's similar all over the world. What is very unusual, though, is that girls are significantly less likely to be stunted than boys. So in many other developing countries, it's the opposite. So we see that families spend more on boys, valued more, and so that reflects in having better health outcomes, but that's not the case here. And then similar on the other things. So when caregivers are more educated, when they have a job, when they have more income, when they live in a wealthier province, they are far less likely to have children who are stunted. So there are lots of structural issues here. And then another powerful finding is that when caregivers say they don't have caregiving support, that was that question I referenced a couple of slides ago, then they are far more likely to have children that are stunted. So having someone to help you really matters. So I think in summary, the statistics show that there isn't really evidence to suggest that men are irresponsible custodians of cash transfers. So I want to take a short break there just to see if any of you have any questions or comments. And then I'll talk about the findings from the interviews with the in-depth interviews with the men after that. Hi.
I had one question. When you said that it's quite low the grant in South Africa, is it low compared to Brazil and Mexico?
Yes. So I don't have the exact figures, but I know for sure that in Brazil and Mexico it's substantially higher than it is here. Hi. Oh, okay, sorry. I was looking for that mic.
Yeah,
Oh, it's here. Thanks.
Okay, good evening or afternoon. I'm Isaac from MI Academy. I'm a poet and author. I want to find out the reasons why men are absent in the lives of their children. Whereas I have some answers based on my research and my writings, but I want to hear the different sentiment.
Yeah.
And then one, before you can answer, I can give based on the relationship between men and women, or a male partner and a female partner. Because now we are saying men are absent, but we find that the challenges between the two couples, one is prohibited, not or eligible to see the children or to raise them. Thank you very much.
I'll ask you to hold those thoughts, please, because in the next set of findings, I am going to talk about that more. So, in the next part of the presentation covers why men apply and why they don't apply for child support grants, and that's related to why they are involved in their families' lives or not. So, we'll get there in the next part of the presentation. I think it's still on. Yeah, it's on.
Hi, Shireen Hassan from CSDA. Just a comment. I think that obviously because of the significantly low amount of the CSG, especially children are being brought up with families, they are opting to go the foster care route. So we get huge intake for foster care, and the common thing is moms deceased, fathers whereabouts unknown. Up to about 90% of children in foster care that we deal with unrelated cases. The other thing also, on the flip side of it, what we're finding is with the new Children's Act, a lot of courts are granting unabridged birth certificates. So you actually finding fathers. Interestingly enough, we are finding fathers, whereas initially we were told that fathers whereabouts unknown, granny doesn't know where he is or whatever. So that's also sort of a, not huge amounts, but we are tracing fathers. And also in terms of your Section 21s and 23s of the Children's Act, more and more fathers are coming forward to apply for primary care of their children. Especially if they were not married to the mom. Maybe the child is in the care of the mom, but they are coming forward and going to courts to apply for primary care, which in itself is also, I think, maybe a good thing, because they are coming forward.
Yeah.
Not in big numbers, but they are. There is a slight shift in those type of cases that we are making.
I think that's great to hear. And that I'll also touch on that a bit later as well, just the barriers to men identifying as primary caregivers. It's also interesting to hear what your comment about the foster care grants, because this is a substantially larger amount of money.
Almost 1,000.
Yeah, so that's more than double the amount of the CSG, but it's a more complicated process, right?
Much more.
Yeah.
But it's happening. Social workers are working there, but also, engaging in dialogue is also causing the foster care system to, in a sense, be overburdened.
Yeah.
So there's also that thing of the middle, I forget what it's called, between the CSG and the foster care grant, that will maybe.
Care dependency.
No, it's not care dependency for children with disabilities. The idea, I think, is to lift the burden on the foster care system and the social workers who are able to investigate these cases so that there can be access to that sort of middle grant. I forget what it's called, but there is something that's been declared, but it would need obviously Treasury to approve it, and then it would go via SASA, the route of SASA, so that granny or aunt or whoever would go direct to SASA and apply for their grant, and then only if SASA feels they have the criteria, you know SASA has very strict criteria, then they will think, okay, maybe let's rather refer to the social worker for investigation. But if it's straightforward, then that kind of a grant can be looked at. So we are hoping, those of us who work in this field, that grant will at some point come into place, because really the foster care system is struggling.
Thank you for that.
Hi, Zoheb. My name is Des. I'm from the Department of Social Development, National. From a policy space,
Yes.
what are the recommendations that you can give government in kind of incorporating a gender lens when they are developing some of these policies?
I keep, this is sounding a bit silly now, but I'll cover it later. It is coming towards, at the end of the presentation, I will end with 2 or 3 slides that are directly that. So policy recommendations and just implications for the way that we do social protection. There's 2 at the back there and then one on this side.
Hi,
Oh,
my
yeah.
name is Bijan, I'm a social worker at RNN.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask, is it taken into consideration when deciding how much the social grant is, the different developmental stages that children are? Because you get children who are infants who need nappies, diet, formulas and stuff like that, whereas they still need to support the family, and then you get a child that's in grade 10 or 11 who's also living off that grant, and that grant is not meeting their developmental needs at that stage.
So the amount of the grant doesn't differ according to the age of the child. So if the child is 2 years old or 17 years old, they'll get the same amount of money. And again, it's another recommendation to talk to later, but there are ways that, so there are lots of services offered by the DSD and other departments that are targeted to specific age groups. And something that could be done better is integration of that with the child support grant. So for example, if you have 15, 16-year-olds, people in the grade 10, 11, starting to make choices about their careers, for example, then they should be, especially child support grant kids, because those are the most vulnerable in that age group. They should be linked better with existing services about career guidance and applying to universities, bursaries, that kind of thing. With the younger children, similar kind of thing. Like there should be better integration with things like the primary schooling system, for example. There were 2 on that side.
Hi, my name is Nikki. I have a question around the statistic around 70% of unemployed fathers did not want to work, the one related to your question.
Yeah.
Was there a similar sort of study, or could you derive a similar statistic for women? And what was the result of it?
I did, and I forgot to put it into this, but it was more prevalent in the men, and I don't know how much more prevalent, but it definitely was. So that it was striking.
So men were less likely to want to work than women.
Right.
There's an age issue.
So-
There's another question.
So as Prof. Patel is saying, that maybe that's due to the fact that on average the men that receive the grant are about 10 years older. So 46 was the average age, and so that might have a bearing on the ability to work.
Hi, I'm Anya from KPMG. I've got some questions around stunting. So firstly, are the stunting graphics or curves, are they international? Okay.
Yes.
And then in terms of, you say a younger child is more likely to be stunted than an older child. What are the, say, lingering impacts of a child being stunted when they, say, 4 versus, say, by the time they're 6, they're no longer stunted? What are the impacts that continue to be felt in those children?
Okay. Firstly, the measure of stunting that was used here was the one that's in NIDS, and that is based on the World Health Organization's global guidelines for measuring stunting. So there's a hypothetical reference curve that you place all of your observations along, and then you see whether the child is in a normal kind of range of height for their age. Secondly, the lingering impacts of stunting. So I didn't address that here, but from other work, longitudinal work in other developing countries, and in South Africa as well, people at UCT have done this. They've shown that being stunting when you're a small child has impacts on school performance when you're in high school, for example. That's one of the big findings from South Africa, but that's replicated in other countries too.
Thank you. So from like a social basement perspective, and where the money should be focused, I think that's something that I think we're always arguing. You have to invest in ECD. If you don't, you can have the base program things on. So
And that's also hard, because then you think of older children and kids are about to head into the labor market and just kind of being left to fend for themselves, which is pretty much what happens when kids age out of the CSG. It's difficult choices. Okay. I'll take one more now and then more at the end.
Thank you. My name is Info. I'm a social worker. I just have a question around the social grant agency. I don't hear you highlighting the role of SASA as like their means test towards dismissing men as recipients.
That's coming. So we'll take more questions at the end, if that's okay. I'll get to you first. Thanks.
So I just wanted to make one point which we kind of not we're losing. Is this last point here, because this is absolutely profound. And that is that there's no evidence in this study and in 4 different sets of data that there are differences between men and women who get the grant in terms of the outcomes for the children. Now, it is widely believed that grants given to women, and this is cited over the last 30 years in all the development literature, including many UNICEF reports, that money given to women, the wisdom is that money given to women will be spent on children in the household. And Zoheb's research is turning that around a bit. And so that's quite profound, because it's saying the men who are getting it doesn't mean all men, but the ones who are getting it with the profiles that we see here, and this is a vast data set. I mean, how many people in one wave of NIDS is about 33 to 38,000 people. So this is not a small sample, this is a large samples in the National Income Dynamics Survey. So that would be fascinating, that's very significant and interesting. And something that we could talk about a bit later on. But it does just challenge our own assumptions that we've made. Okay.
Yeah, I think that is the important point. So often when people see the results about empowerment and that women are feeling extra burdened by receiving these grants, the thinking is that, well, if it's for the benefit of the children, then it's fine. If we give it to a man, then the children will suffer. But this is perhaps showing that's not necessarily the case. There isn't really a justification for continuing in this way, in a way that is reinforcing gender inequalities. And just a point on the sample. So the sample sizes are very big. The numbers of men receiving the child support grant in each individual wave are small, but that's mitigated by the advantage of having these several waves of data, so that the numbers increase substantially when you exploit the longitudinal nature of the data.
And then to be getting a consistent finding of
Yeah.
each data point, you're getting the same finding. And I think that's also very important to bear in mind. It's not just one wave, it's across the all the 5 waves, except for the one tweak. Okay.
So now I go into the qualitative findings. So this is not analysis of secondary survey data. This is direct one-on-one interviews with men that receive the grant. These interviews were done in the SASSA office in Maponya Mall. Interestingly, most of the men did not know that they were eligible to receive the grant before something happened. So application spurred by a negative event in most cases. So in almost every case, something happened that forced the man to now find out more about the grant. A woman was receiving it previously, and that woman either died, so this could be the man's partner or his sister or his mother was receiving a child support grant and looking after a child. She passed away, and then the child needed to be looked after. And then the men found out that they could actually have the grant transferred into their name. Another issue is separation. That's another reason why a woman might no longer be receiving the grant, because the parents split up. And then in 2 cases, I think, irresponsibility. So the father of the child believed that the mother of the child was no longer responsible, and for that reason felt he needed to take over the grant himself. Another reason was, in a substantial minority of cases, was delayed co-residence. So this was a situation where the man was not living with his child because of the bola. So he'd been prevented from living with the child because he hadn't paid. And then by the point in time where he managed to make the payment, then the child moved in with him, and then he started receiving the grant in his name. Many of the men interviewed, about more than half, did not have much caregiving experience. So something happens, they're suddenly left with having to look after a child, and they don't know what to do. And this, from the data, we see it's pretty much due to the fact that they're not socialized into these roles. So unlike in the case of women who are expected to look after children and grow up in that environment where there are other women that do this, for most of the men in the study, there's no comparable experience. In terms of employment, there was just one out of 15 who was employed full-time. And this is a finding that's in contrast to one of the statistical findings. So all of the others reported doing casual work or piece jobs on some kind of informal basis. So in the surveys, the survey data, that the answer to that question was no. The vast majority said they weren't doing any work like that. But in the qualitative sample, it's the direct opposite. All are actually doing work. So some examples of that are things like volunteering at the kids' school for a small kind of stipend to do maintenance and coaching sports. One of the men coached his daughter's cricket team. Other stuff common was just kind of informal selling. So as and when things become available, like sweets and snacks. They sell those on an informal basis. So I think there's a lot of this activity happening, and my suspicion is that it's not captured very well in the survey data, and that more effort needs to go into recording that kind of economic activity. So a major finding is that men, all of them, do gender very differently to hegemonic norms. So by doing gender, this just means they enact their masculine identities in ways that are very different to what is commonly expected. And what is commonly expected is hegemonic norms. So hegemonic norms in South Africa, but also elsewhere, would be that men don't really get too involved in the kind of messy work of caregiving. It's more like you have a job and you bring home money. And in South Africa, in low-income context, that often translates into absence due to being unable to find a job. So you feel like, if I can't get an income, then there's nothing else for me to do. That's a sort of norm here, but not with these men. So for them, they have constructed their identities as men and as fathers with built around the central idea of being responsible. So this comes up in all of the interviews, and it runs throughout that they are responsible people. And being responsible is evidenced by sticking around and doing what you have to do for your child, and persevering despite how difficult things might be. And things are very difficult for them. I mean, because they live in poverty, just like all the women that receive the grant. And also because, and as I will explain more, a lot of them are very isolated and some depressed as well. Another very different way of being a man that comes across in these interviews is that they believe that being emotionally engaged is very important. So often men are expected to be kind of distant, and especially from children's emotional needs. And a lot of the men themselves grew up with father figures who are very much like that. If not their biological fathers, then other older men around them that are very kind of austere and disciplinarian and keeping the kids at kind of arm's length. But they all believe that that's not how things should be, all of them. But a lot also believed that despite recognizing that, women are still better at it. So women are still kind of just intrinsically better at that aspect of caregiving. And then another important finding is that all of the men engage in care work, although this is to varying degrees and with different justifications. So most of the men in this sample are single fathers, and did the work because they say it has to be done. Like if I don't do it, then who's going to do it? And if I don't do it, then I will be irresponsible, and that conflicts with my idea about being responsible and as what it means to be a good man. So they do it just because they have to. Some of these men say there's no woman available to do it, so I have to do it. Another common finding is that these men don't justify it from the perspective of saying, well, there's no woman, so I have to, but because it would be unfair to a woman to expect her to do it instead. So that was interesting to see. With the men who are cohabiting or with an unmarried partner or married, then it's slightly different. Here it's pretty much justified on the basis of, well, she's still the primary caregiver and I'll help her out. So if she's at work or if she's busy and not around, then I'll step in. And then again, that's linked to a very kind of the conservative idea about women are just better suited to it. So all of that in combination kind of suggests that gender norms can be reinterpreted and remolded. So we look at things, gender norms in society, and we think these are unchangeable and people are bound by them, and that's you're stuck in a kind of jail of gender identity, but all of this is malleable, and people, and especially these men, reinterpret and think through how they can be men differently and are not stuck with rigid gender norms. But despite that ability to be flexible, it doesn't mean that things are all kind of smooth sailing. So stigma attached to men receiving the grant is really powerful. So, and this is because in the popular imagination, the CSG is associated with women and with unemployment. So gender norm, popular, hegemonic gender norms in this country is that if you're a man, you shouldn't be doing women's work or be associated with anything feminine. So that is a reason why a lot of men feel stigmatized. They feel kind of looked down on by a lot of men, but women as well. And then secondly, it's associated with unemployment. So a lot of the men, when they talk about the grants, it's for unemployed people. So it's for people who have failed almost to be able to look after themselves, and so they've had to get a grant. And so that's another sign of failure. And that's despite the fact that unemployment is a statistical normality in Soweto. Most adults are unemployed, but it's still very much seen like it's a failure. And so that leads to a lot of these men feeling very isolated, not having adult friends really, and also a reluctance to seek help. So they don't feel like it's worth their effort to go and ask people for help, whether that's friends and family or formal assistance at a care service or government department. So all of the men report a scarcity of male-centered childcare services. So they all talk about childcare services as being very female-centered, and that don't really account for the fact that men might need different kind of support. And that often they'll say when they go to the SASSA offices, they're the only man around, and it feels very isolating, and they feel very like they stick out, and a lot of attention is on them, and a lot of that attention is quite negative. Another thing that they mention in terms of the grant administration, so this is just the applying for the grant and having it renewed and all of that, is they feel a lot of mistrust from SASSA bureaucrats. So some bureaucrats have internalized this idea that grants are for women. Some don't seem to know that men can receive the grant. Others who do know are still mistrustful. They're like, why are you looking after a child? There must be something dodgy going on here. Another common complaint is inefficiency. So applying for grants and it taking a very long time to be processed. There was a case of one man who his sister had died, and then he took on the care of her 2 children, and one of the children had cerebral palsy and should have been getting a disability grant, which is of a much higher value, or care dependency grant, but was turned down on multiple occasions despite a very kind of obvious case. And then also weaknesses in complementary services. So all talk about, going to the clinic and things not going smoothly, wasting huge amounts of money on public transport, schooling. So all people who receive the CSG are entitled to no fee paying schools, but many of the men here still send their kids to fee paying schools because they believe that the no fee paying schools aren't good enough. And then community safety. So I hope you read the report, but in there you'll see that for many of these men, throughout the interview, they're in a state of like near panic about where their kids are and that things are really unsafe, and they don't want to let the kid out of their sight, and it's sad. But so another very interesting thing here is that I've mentioned that the norm about about fatherhood for men is that it's about financial provision, and so these men are using the CSG to do that, and that's very unusual. But there's no reason why more men can't do that, right? And then what my conclusion from all of this, just seeing that the men are really committed caregivers, they all do care work, they care very much about the children. So I see that the CSG and care work are complementary. So receiving the child support grant helps them to be better caregivers. So I don't see evidence of this a legitimate concern, which is that receiving a child support grant could be just used for their own benefit. So that also fits with the statistical findings. So the men aren't misusing the money. But I also don't see any evidence of men getting this money and using it as a mechanism to like wield power over their children and partners. So the implications of all of this. Firstly, changing the distribution of care is central to gender-sensitive social protection. So this just means that it's almost entirely women that are responsible for childcare, and to make social protection more gender-sensitive, we need to get more men involved in this. And this can be done with cash transfers and designing them in such a way that we get more men to claim them. So how can the CSG be modified? So I would say expand male uptake, definitely for single fathers. So where there's a case of a man who's looking after a child with no support and he's on his own, or if a woman has died and then he has to look after the child, there's no reason why this responsibility should fall to another woman. I think single fathers should be motivated to apply for the grant and take it up. And also for cohabiting couples. Though here I think care needs to be exercised. So I've said there's a danger of patriarchal backlash. So I haven't found evidence for this in my study, but it remains a possibility that there is just something special about men that receive the grant now. And that if you had to start rapidly expanding uptake to the general population, other men might be slightly different and see the grants in a different way and might use it in different ways. So crucially, I think that we need to have more research that is done with women when their male partners receive a CSG, because my study didn't look at that. So I only talked to the men, but what about when they live with their wives or their partners? What do they think about the men receiving the grant? Do they miss receiving the money themselves, or do they feel like when the male partner receives it and is actually involved in caregiving, that expands her opportunities? Maybe that makes her more able to go and get a job or have a career. So either way, just enhance male involvement in childcare, because it benefits children, it benefits their partners, and very clearly from my work, despite all the difficulties that these men face, they all are, at the end of the day, very happy for the fact that they are in their children's lives and they see that they're making a difference in the lives of their children. So expanding uptake and just changing gender norms means changing communications. So this is firstly just about the CSG in particular. So there needs to be more of an effort by government, I think, to make it clearer that men can apply. So a lot of the imagery you see of the CSG, you see pictures of women, for example. You never see that that men can see it. That needs to be made more obvious. But then more broadly, just outside the CSG itself, we need to normalize alternate discourses of masculinity. So this just means challenging the gender stereotypes. So just showing that men can be involved and caring caregivers, and that there's no kind of There's nothing wrong with being a caregiver in the way that we associate with how women are caregivers. And this, I think, needs to also involve highlighting the benefits of this for men. So it's not all a big sacrifice, although it does involve sacrifice. It's not just about that. It benefits the men and their partners, so it's better, and their children, so you have better relationships with people. And that it's also okay to seek help. So a lot of these men are isolated, and that needs to change. And you can do this in general terms, but also you can do it more practically by, for example, funding things like caregiving classes, and also just having a space where men that receive a child support grant can come together and get to know each other, just make friends. So that was another thing that there was only, I think, 1 or 2 of the men that I spoke to that actually knew another man that received the CSG. All of the others thought, they were the only person in their network that received a grant. So that would be useful. And then male-centered services. So by centered, I just mean, that's probably the wrong word. It's just services that are also, that account for the fact that men receive grants too, and that men are also caregivers. And behavioral change programs. So in Rwanda and Malawi this year, they have started doing this kind of thing. So caregiving classes and gender norm programming to try and move discourse away from the kind of very gender unequal norm that is very much like how it is here. So those 2 countries are doing really interesting things. This is the final slide. So another major recommendation is that we need to improve the caregiving infrastructure that erodes the monetary value of the grants. So this is just what I said before. So grant recipients shouldn't be spending 1/3 of the grant on transport. They shouldn't be feeling a need to send their kids to fee-paying schools. The no-fee schools should be operating and providing a good education. And that will not only benefit the men that receive the grant, but everyone. And this requires coordination. So we need to coordinate the grant system with the education system and the health system. Another important thing here, just based on the fact that so few of the men are working and that it's so difficult to access income besides the grant, is just to make links with labor market programs. So I think it would be very useful to expand training programs that upskill adults and that enhance their ability to make an income or to start a business, for example. There is other work at the CSDA that shows how important these kinds of training programs can be for adults. And then finally, we can also make an effort, I think, to share care burdens more with the state. So this just means we shouldn't expect that poor men and women should be entirely responsible for looking after children. I think it's a shared social responsibility that we need to look after our young people. And so this is very much the case in Europe, for example. And we don't have the same kind of resources, obviously, but in other developing countries, this is happening. So, for example, in Mexico and Brazil, in recent years, there's been a big expansion in public care facilities. So this is just childcare where you can leave your child if you work, either for free or at a very low subsidized rate. In South Africa, we have these kinds of facilities, but trust in them is very low. And then also public works. So we have a community public works program in South Africa. I just think we need to value it more. And that could be a source of job creation in a sector of the economy that is traditionally undervalued, underappreciated. So that's it, and I look forward to discussion.